Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session on surveys and monitoring. My name is Þórdís Sveinsdóttir. I work for the DCC, and I'll be the chair for this meeting. Assisting me is also Diana Sisu from the DCC, so we have someone here on hand to help you if there are any technical issues. So when you log in, can I please ask that you turn off your microphone at least, and maybe camera as well, just to give a bit better bandwidth and reduce echo. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing because we haven't got a lot of time to begin with. But yeah, so we're looking at kind of current work that's being undertaken to survey and monitor kind of on different levels, national level, institutional level, and on the researcher level, work around data curation, data reuse, and open research and open data sharing more broadly. So I'll hand over to the first talk. We'll do the 3 talks in succession, and please hang on to your questions till the end. Excuse me. If you can put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we will monitor that. And when it comes to the questions, we will offer you to turn on your microphone so you can ask the questions with your voice. It just gives like a nicer session feel. Or if you don't want to, you can also just ask through text, just let us know. But yes, so the first talk today, hello, someone has a microphone on. Can you please turn off your microphone? A lot of disturbance. Diana, can you turn off all the microphones? Except the speaker one.
Okay.
Do you hear the feedback, or is it just me?
Off. I can hear it too. I'll try and turn the microphone off.
Okay, thank you. So yes, the first talk we have today is by Lisa Johnston, who is responsible for research data management and curation at the University of Minnesota, and Renata Curti, who is a research facilitator at the University of California. So I'll hand over to you, Lisa and Renata.
Well, Renata, you might be muted.
Sorry, I'm so sorry about that. I think I was muted automatically. So thank you everyone for attending our presentation. My name is Renata Curti, and as I was introduced, I work at UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara. I'll be handing over to Lisa to introduce herself and to continue the presentation.
Hi, everybody. Lisa Johnston here. Good to see you. You can go to the next slide. We are actually presenting on behalf of a larger group. This is the Data Curation Network. We've been funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation in the United States with, right now we have 12 partners. And you can go to the next slide. We've been asking ourselves, what does it mean to curate data? We each curate data differently. And we actually recently, in the United States, there was a draft desirable characteristics of repositories that suggested that a desirable characteristic would be to have curation and quality assurance. And we know that curation is not just a binary thing, either you're doing it or you're not. It's quite a spectrum. There's a lot involved here. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that we're asking a number of questions then. And we decided to create a survey to really understand what levels of curation are US data repositories providing, and how does that impact the actual value of the data? What are we adding to that end product? Next slide. So our collaborators created this survey where we asked very specifically, what level of curation are you providing for this repository? We actually then asked about 30 additional questions of which specific actions are you taking, how often, how often per data set are you taking these different actions? And then we asked a series of perception questions, really to understand you as an individual, what do you feel that that action or that level of curation has on the data sharing process? Next slide, please. So these are our levels. We did a lot of research amongst the different data repositories in the network, but also looking at the Core Trust Seal, which has defined levels of curation. And we actually analyzed all 100 of the Core Trust Seal successful certified repository applications to understand, in detail, what were they doing? What did they consider curation at that level? And so you'll see here this spectrum where at level 0, the data are distributed as deposited. Where at level 1, you're going into the record, you're reviewing the metadata, you're trying to increase that record for findability. At level 2, you're actually looking at the files, you're arranging them or performing conversions for accessibility. Level 3, you're reading the documentation, you're thinking about the reusability of the data. And then finally, that data level curation, you're opening up the data files, you're thinking about accuracy or interoperability. Next slide. So as you could probably see, the Core Trust Seal levels are highly influenced in our survey questions, as well as the FAIR principles. But we also did a number of other lit reviews where we analyzed different published workflows from data repositories. We looked, of course, at the DTC lifecycle to analyze the specific actions taken, and then try to really define those actions so that we can really have that shared language for the survey and across our different data repositories in the data curation network. Next slide.
Well,
oh yeah, go ahead. Go.
Okay, so the survey was designed and intended to collect responses limited to the U.S. territory. We had we adopted a non-probabilistic sampling technique. So the recruitment was carried out through multiple listservs, professional listservs. And due to that, we acknowledge that there is a risk of bias and data skewness towards higher level of creation, and also that we cannot generalize the results. The survey was open for during 3 weeks in January this year, and we got 120 responses in total, but we only analyzed 95 cases which were based on the US. Our preliminary data analysis was conducted based on the overall responses, not at the repository level. We got 34 responses from directors, 52 from staff, 4 from depositors, 5 from users. And this, we also have here the breakdown of responses in terms of repository type. We had 59 unique repos representing our sample from 23 different states in the US. And from those, 10 are Core Trust Seal approved, and 11 of them are DCN members. Here are the results for the levels of curation. We had 73% of the respondents reporting data level of curation, so level 4 by the repository. And just to explain a little bit about the difference between these two graphs, in the first one, it was a multiple response question. And so they indicated as many levels they would perceive that the repository would comply with. And in the second graph, on the right-hand side, you see when we combined the data and we did identifying the maximum level of curation performed. So in that case, the level 4 was the most prominent. In terms of frequency, we can take a look at this graph, and we are going to see that this chart unveils that all levels of active curation, so from L1 and L4, are performed most or half of the time according to 70% of the participants. Implying that, in their opinion, most of the repositories in our sample are committed to curation efforts. We also asked about additional data standards. So whenever they believe that a repository is complying with interoperability, reproducibility, peer review, and we can see here the results that according to participants, most of the time or half of the time, interoperability is a concern for those repositories. Not that often the data is peer reviewed. In terms of specific curation actions, we had a list of 27 curation actions that can be combined into those different levels of curation. And we observe in this graph that for most of the time, for the majority of the respondents, the repositories are checking for duplicate files, reviewing documentation and metadata for accuracy and quality, but not that often the data is being edited or the quality and accuracy has been checked. In terms of perception with regards to the value and impact of curation, here we can see that for most of the respondents, the majority of them agreed with the statement that data curation adds value to the data sharing process, and they believe that data curation outweighs the effort and cost of data sharing. If we look at the left-hand side, we see the top 5 items, they say, that impact on data curation, and it's to make the ability to make the data findable, understandable, usable, accessible, and also the possibility of analyzing data. We also have a number of open free text responses, and we are in the process of analyzing them. So, and we hope to publish them soon. So I'm going to hand it over to Liza again to talk about the preliminary takeaways.
Sorry to rush you, but if you can speed up and finish, because we're up to 7 minutes.
Sure, this is our last slide. These are preliminary results. We are still analyzing all of the data we received, but we're really interested to report that most of our repository staff are reporting this highest level of curation, but the responses for the same repository are not always in agreement. And we're also just really interested to hear about how we as repository staff feel that our actions are adding value to the data, specifically for finding, understanding, and reusing that data. So more to come as we publish our results in our final slide there, and thank you so much for your attention. Yep, and that I think that's just to wrap up our, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. That was very interesting. Yeah, please post your questions in the Q&A tab, and you can vote for each other's questions there as well and upvote them. So the next talk is on the EOSC landscape, so moving from a static picture to living monitoring. This is from Federica Tanlongo from the GAR Consortium and the EOSC Secretariat. Over to you, Federica.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So, introduction first. EOSC Pillar is one of 4 regional projects funded in the INFRA-EOSC 5 landscape, and this is me. Beside being the deputy coordinator of the project, I'm also working to create our Italian national initiative. But here today I'm with the head of the INFRA-EOSC 5 landscape task force. So who are we? We have 4 regional projects that cover more or less the entire Europe. The FAIR project, which is focused on whatever is entailed by being fair, and the EOSC Secretariat project, which is supporting the EOSC governance right now. So where we started from the idea that you need to go somewhere, you need to know where you are. So we started our journey in the key indicators world when we began to look around where we were. And as you wouldn't travel lightly in an uncharted territory, we designed a set of activities in our project to map what was already there. So now we weren't alone in this, and we started to collaborate with the EOSC governance, and in particular with the EOSC landscape working group. So even before the project started, we compared our approaches and decided what to monitor. And this is the first very general points we found out we had in common. The main point was to monitor how the National Open Science Initiative in the countries were doing, and at what point they were. So we decided on about macro areas. So training and skills, national policies, the stakeholders, the business models, the services, the standards, and we saw that we had quite a lot to monitor. Of course, this monster slide shows the difficulties of this approach. We had quite a lot of things we wanted to keep under control, but it was quite impossible. And we had to somehow find a way to have fewer indicators, easier to use, and measurable. Also, we discovered quite a lot of other things that we wanted measurable indicators, but numbers without context are useless. And this is something that was made very clear when we compared our desk approach with the stakeholders' views. So we put together quite a lot of bulky documentation between the projects and the EOS governance working group. But we also discovered it was growing old in no time. And so all this work was becoming useless. That's why we decided to move to living indicators. And we decided to define a working proposal with a set of indicators in 5 micro areas: architecture, organization and governance, policies, infrastructure and training. And then we put together this proposal and we put it to the test through a consultation process. First, through co-creation workshop held at the EOS Hub Week 2020, and then with online consultation. So in the 2 rounds, we included like 200 people, most of which were directly or indirectly involved in the governance of the European Open Science Cloud. And about 1/3 of the governing board of the EOSC, which for those who are not really into EOSC, are the member states members, delegates.
1 minute
responded to provide feedback. So the analysis is published on Zenodo, so you can learn quite a lot of it if you want, or get in touch. And we now set up, the next step is that we are setting up an indicators POC. The objective is to try our approach with monitoring living indicators to measure the EOSC readiness at the level of member states through the gathering of automatic and non-automatic data collection at the country level. So we'll have a platform with a dashboard approach that gathers data from trusted open data sources and representatives of the national initiatives that can contribute qualitative information to integrate the data and provide much needed context. What we want to get from these, we want to access information and have a up-to-date mapping of the situation at the country level and map the progresses of time. But why? Because we want to discover areas of improvement and success stories that can guide the others to progress. And also we want information for national initiatives to lobby their governments for investments and better policy making. If you want to learn more,
we have to move on.
Yeah, that was the last slide.
Oh, thank you so much. Sorry to rush you. So I'll hand over to Heidi Imker, who is the Director of Research Data Service at the University of Illinois. And she's going to present to us self-reported data reuse associated with highly cited journal articles. Over to you, Heidi.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Right, so I'm going to talk just really a research study that I and my colleagues have just completed. And I can't, for some reason, advance. Fascinating. So our research motivations basically were, we've continued to have a disconnect, honestly, between, when we talk to researchers on a day-to-day basis about, policies and practices for data reuse and data sharing and those sorts of things. So we wanted to design actually a survey study where we would hear people who were from the enthusiastic to the skeptical, thinking that, maybe some people weren't necessarily, replying to data sharing surveys, and maybe some of the disconnects that we had been hearing were just a missed population. We also wanted to frame the survey really in something that could be really grounding for the researchers, because sometimes it also seems like data sharing and reuse can seem sort of abstract. So for that, we chose to focus on corresponding authors of highly cited journal articles. As corresponding authors, they would be responsible for all of the research, so it should be a good touch point. And as journal articles and highly cited, it's probably pretty important to the career, so hopefully at the forefront of their mind. And a good context then for thinking about data sharing policies in relation to publisher and journal policies. So, and then finally, we wanted to incorporate some of the reasons that we had heard for not sharing or reusing data that we had heard. And for this, I'm just going to focus on one, which was that data cannot always address new research questions. So this is basically a two-part survey strategy. So in the first part, survey A, we use the Scopus database and the API to find highly cited articles across 9 disciplines, where the corresponding author was from the University of Illinois, since that's where we'd been hearing some of this disconnect. We had 49 responses, 27% rate. And then the second part of this was to go back to the Scopus database and find all of the citations that were associated with our 48 responses, because for every one of those surveys, a corresponding author was replying to questions about a specific article. So then we could go back, get everybody who cited those specific articles and do a survey for them. And for that, we had 240 responses. So just going to focus on a few things here. So we had 48 total for the first one, survey A. We immediately asked, is there data associated, so we could not, so we could filter that way and not bias our results. 39 articles had associated data, and 35 answered the question about whether or not they reused data themselves for the research presented in that article. 40% said yes, which is not insignificant by any means. 60% said no, and the most selected reason why is because there was not existing data to answer their specific research question. So how does that relate then to the second set of survey respondents, which were the citing authors? Because theoretically, in our thoughts, there's a direct relationship between people who cited and the people who had done the original initial work. And so as far as pools of people who might be interested in the data and interested in reuse, it seemed like those authors might be good candidates. So of the 240 responses, all of them, answered this question. If they reused any of the data that was associated with that initial article, 15% said yes, and 85% said no. And actually, even higher than in Survey A, the most selected reason is that the data that was associated with that initial article could not address their specific research question. So this has been, just really interesting for us and helps us reflect on, why there's been, a little bit of hesitancy or some just variability in how people have replied to data sharing. So this is some of the numeric results. We had tons of comments and they were equally fascinating. And I'll just give two as a highlight here. So for example, someone said, we don't reuse data, and their rationale was, perfectly good, because, for that initial paper, why? Because, the data is publicly available and can be tailored to my analysis. So it seems that they didn't really need access. This is, to me, the most evocative comment of the whole survey, which was someone who said that they did reuse data, but then went on to say that we've made the wrong assumptions, that data are used insofar as it refers to conclusions, but the paper used in the second person's paper, citing author's paper, used other people's conclusions drawn from their data, hence why they said that they reused data, but had no need for the raw data. So that's a really interesting, almost like secondary use of data, and something that we, in general, probably really can think of as data reuse. So just a few concluding remarks here. We did see what felt like a surprising lack of mutual interest in the underlying data. And it seemed that a major rationale was that the data were not useful. And we tend to focus on usability. We do create curation because it's really important and we want to make sure it's usable. But there does seem to be, some sorts of data or some situations where we might want to really think more about the usefulness of it to begin with. We also saw a surprising presence of data sharing reuse directly from the PDF. So they called it data reuse, but those tend to not qualify as data reuse based on open science norms. And so I think that also helps us take a step back and think about how people's perceptions of this are coming across. And then finally, this is preliminary work. It's not confirmational. We only had 4 responses for biochemistry, for example, so we would never try and generalize across that whole discipline for this. And even more than that, one of our reviewers wondered whether or not this was generalizable. And one of the things that we've really taken away from it is that we probably maybe need to pause on generalizations a little bit, and we'd really like to dig more into, what is useful and what's necessary for reuse, from these sorts of specific research projects that are presented in articles. And our reviewers are also very interested in what we're sharing. So we've shared as much as possible. The API scripts are available. You do need to have access to the Scopus API and create a database that's there. Also all the de-identified survey data, et cetera, et cetera. And we do have a paper coming out. It's just accepted. So hopefully that will be of interest to a few people.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Thank you, everyone, to the speakers. So we are running out of time for questions. But I wanted to, if anyone has a burning question, do you want to turn on your mic and ask a quick one? We have 1 minute, 38 seconds. Otherwise, you can obviously liaise with the authors via email through the Juno platform in the lunch hour and so on and so forth. So handing it over, is there anyone in the audience that wants to ask a quick question? I see most of the questions have been answered in the chat already, so that's very efficient. Joy, did you have a question? Someone's walking around on their microphone. Hang on, Robin is there. Hi,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So since Joy wasn't coming on, I thought I'd go ahead. Do you think that the surprising comment that you found, do you think that means that researchers are just taking for granted the conclusions of the data in other people's papers and not feeling the need to go verify it for themselves, just citing those results, in which case an error could just keep on going through the scholarly record?
Yeah, I definitely think that could be true. And we actually did have a comment that says, conclusions are generally accepted and, unless there's some sort of glaring discrepancy. But we also had some examples of people who were doing validation studies, but the data itself was not the important part of those validation studies. So for example, in organic chemistry, if you're trying to reduce somebody else's, organic synthesis, you actually have to do the synthesis, and the data itself isn't actually important to the conclusion. Not in that way anyway.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've just been informed that the session isn't ending. So if anyone has a burning question, now is the time to ask it. But then we will move over to go to lunch, I imagine. Okay, well, thank you so much to the speakers, some of which are awake at an ungodly hour. So I hope you have a lovely rest of the day, and I'll catch up with you on the Juno platform and at the rest of the conference. Thank you so much again. Very interesting talks.